All right, y'all, we're going to go ahead and get started. We'll let folks trickle in. But good morning, everyone, and welcome to Show Us the Money, Alameda County Budget Training 2025. We are really excited to have you here in this important moment and training that's really going to enable us, right, to make those meaningful investments in the critical community care that we need to thrive right now, y'all. So, as we're sort of coming into this space, I invite folks to go ahead and check in the chat by introducing themselves with their name, pronouns, where you're tuning in from, and if you want a little fun bonus question, something that you ate for breakfast this morning. All righty. So before we dive in, I just want to quickly go over some quick Zoom housekeeping items for you all to keep in mind, as this is a webinar format, which means that you'll only be able to see us five panelists for the duration of this Zoom meeting. But you will be able to use the chat function in two ways. You can chat to everyone for general comments. So as you're checking in, that's where you'll definitely use the chat. You can also use the Q&A function for questions. We'll have two sections dedicated towards answering y'all's questions. We might answer a few in the chat, but again, we will have designated time to do that. So feel free to start getting your questions down. You can also turn on captions via the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can message Jess or myself if you have any tech questions, such as like sound or image quality, but we will try our best to, yeah, make sure everything's running smoothly for y'all. And finally, this webinar is being recorded. Lots of people registered for the recording, so just hang tight with us and we'll get you the recording in a few days. So that brings us to our awesome agenda for the day. We're going to obviously ground in telling you more about who we are. Then we'll go into what we're fighting for in this moment. And then we'll go into a deeper dive of the problems really impacting Alameda County. Then we'll get really specific on ways you can get involved with us and what's coming up next this budget season. Now, I'd like to introduce everyone to our brilliant panel of facilitators that we have today. I'm Natalya. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the Healing Justice Organizer at Restore Oakland. And I'd love to pass it to Kari.
Hey y'all, welcome. So good to see everybody. I'm Kari. Any pronouns are cool. I am the Healing Justice Program Manager at Restore Oakland. And man, y'all didn't play this morning. These breakfasts sound great in the chat. Keep it coming. And I'll pass it to John.
Good morning, you all. It's really great to see you. I'm John Lindsay-Poland. I co-direct the California Healing Justice Program of American Friends Service Committee. Go by he, him, or el. And yeah, just great to see you. I'll pass it to Tash.
Morning, y'all. My name is Tash. I'm also with Restore Oakland Inc., where we roll very deep. And yeah, just honored to be nerding you out with everyone on this beautiful Saturday morning. I'm executive director, and we're also part of the coalition.
Yes, welcome. Thank you all for the lovely introductions. So y'all, that brings us to our first section, right, of letting you know who we all are as organizers, right, to really lay the foundation as to why we are here working towards the democratization of Alameda County's budget. So we are part of the Care First Community Coalition, which is really a collective of abolitionist organizers, mental health advocates, survivors of incarceration, system-impacted family members, who formed in 2021, right, to really mobilize and organize against the rampant criminalization and caging of our people, right, especially those who continually are struggling with mental health. And so our strategic objective is really centered around the decarceration of Santa Rita Jail and the prevention of future criminalization and incarceration of Alameda County residents with behavioral health needs. And right, because we know that, resources are intentionally inaccessible and limited to our people, we also aim to advocate for a county budget that funds the holistic behavioral health care, housing, and community resources that we need. Now, y'all, it takes a village to achieve this work, which is why we are made up of 12 beautiful organizations, including Oakland Rising, Center for Independent Living, Access for All, East Bay Supportive Housing Collaborative, the American Friends Service Committee, Community Health Center Network, NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Health, Asian Health Services, Berkeley Friends Racial Justice Action Team, the Asian Law Caucus, FAMSI, which is Families Advocating for the Seriously Mentally Ill, the Interface Coalition for Justice in Our Jails, and of course, Restore Oakland. Now, because we know, right, that mental illness is stigmatized, too criminalized, and invisibilized in many marginalized communities while homelessness and housing insecurity persist, we are really anchored around prioritizing the needs of communities most impacted by criminalization and behavioral health needs, right? Being sure to center racial equity as a way to directly address and uproot the anti-Blackness that perpetuates, right, the disproportionate targeting and overrepresentation of Black people in the criminal legal system. And given the reality of behavioral healthcare resources being widely inaccessible, right, inadequately funded and not culturally responsive, we also are committed to divesting from carceral institutions and instead investing in community-based solutions, right, that are rooted in that, restorative care and accountability rather than punishment and alienation. Now, we also know that because bureaucracy is hierarchical and very closed off, which makes it difficult for everyday people like us to really get intensely involved with local politics, we practice transparent and consensus-based decision-making. And that's also really rooted in the fact that we need us as a collective at the table making the decisions, right? And finally, we are guided by utilizing data and research to inform policy advocacy, to best combat, right, a lot of the tough on crime rhetoric and fear mongering that's perpetuated by the mainstream media and politicians we are up against. And now I'm going to pass it to Kari to get us grounded in what we're fighting for.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Nat. So yeah, in this section, we just want to highlight a little bit about our history and why we are where we are today, fighting for what we're fighting for today. So here's a quick timeline. We started as a coalition in 2021, and after being born out of several other iterations of really badass community organizing around decarceration and county budget advocacy in Alameda County. And in 2021, we won our first big victory. The Care First, Jails Last policy resolution was adopted by the County Board of Supervisors and was unanimously approved. And what that meant was that we started to see the process for Care First, Jails Last, which we, as a coalition led by AFSC and Restore Oakland, Inc., really advocated for and clarified the needs for this county's behavioral health care and combating the incarceration crisis. And we started to see that the county supervisors were really listening and became one of the most debated issues when the county was deliberating in the budget. In 2023, we saw a lot of y'all are here that I remember being part of this fight with us. We fought and defeated an $80 million proposed expansion of Santa Rita Jail that would have taken tens of millions of dollars of county funding away from community-based care and resources and put them towards incarceration. And then we really started seeing the need for budget advocacy to direct those funds and other funds in our county towards the things that we really desperately need as we face crises of mental illness and homelessness and in Alameda County and beyond. The Babu settlement forced the county to commit funds for wraparound services and full service partnerships to folks that were dealing with serious behavioral health needs. And we've been working hard to figure out how to make that actually happen. And in 2024, the BOS, the Board of Supervisors, adopted the 58 Care First Jails Last recommendations that a task force that we were a major part of that we created. And so those 58 Care First Jails Last recommendations were very evidence-based research policies that were designed to create the kind of county that we want to live in, one where our most vulnerable residents have the housing and healthcare that they need, and where people are trying their best to be decarcerated and diverted from incarceration, and where our Board of Supervisors is committed to funding care over cages. So we got those approved and adopted, but now the task is, where is the money? How are we funding them? How are we implementing those solutions? So that's where we're at right now. And that's why y'all are here. So this year, we have seen that the Care First implementation process is well underway. A lot of us in this room, a lot of us in this webinar are heavily involved in Care First implementation. So what that has looked like is participating in additional county committees and task forces to advise agencies and the Board of Supervisors around how the Care First solutions that we're advocating for can be implemented this year. And that requires that people in the community outside of just us make sure that the County Board of Supervisors know that everyone here is invested in this, that they are looking and listening, and that we were going to hold them accountable to funding the solutions that they ostensibly approved and adopted. So the first thing that we're asking for, we're going to talk about this later on, but this is a teaser for folks who maybe can't stay for the whole time. We need to show out next week at the Board of Supervisors meeting and presentation, where we're going to be talking about Care First implementation. And we need folks to mobilize with us to say that this is important to you and why. So we'll talk more about that. The Alameda County budget season, which we'll also go and do a deep dive in a minute, is right around the corner. So the budget season is a very difficult, not transparent process, which is why we are holding this training today. And we're getting folks together to mobilize in support of funding Care First solutions and our budget demands this year, because Care First can't wait. So we're going to be coming through throughout June to show the Board of Supervisors that people in our community know that this is necessary and support that funding. And 3, we have an amazing opportunity this year that we'll talk a lot more about, and that many of y'all, I think, have heard about, which is that our county has officially gotten access to Measure W funding, which is hundreds of millions of dollars of funds that voters approved in 2020 to create housing solutions and prioritize housing for the homeless and the most vulnerable populations in our county. And so the crises that we're facing actually have a direct way to be solved this year using Measure W funds. And we need folks to tell our Board of Supervisors and agencies that we see that, and we are not going to stop until Measure W is used to fund and really address the homelessness crisis and create solutions that support our most vulnerable residents. And what I would like to say for folks who are curious, who are not as involved already, we are going to be pulling together talking points, updates, and action alerts through a Signal thread. And for folks who are not part of that Signal thread already, I'm about to drop in the chat a way for you to join. It is going to be a place where you can get alerted, and it's not going to be too busy. So if you're worried about getting a bunch of messages, don't worry, we're going to be pretty chill with it. So this is in the chat, a way that you can join our text thread where you can get updates. You can also click that QR code. Thank you so much. So this year, what are we advocating for? Our big 4 priorities are permanent supportive housing, which we will talk at length about later in this presentation. But we're basically saying that housing is healthcare in a county where so many of our most marginalized residents don't get access to stable housing. Budget transparency, so actually having a say in how our county funds are allocated and seeing where they go. Expanding decarceration from our jail and pathways to diversion from incarceration. So getting folks who are eligible for diversion to actually be able to go through those processes, and getting folks with serious behavioral health needs out of our jail as soon as possible to protect their health and well-being. And really funding that holistic behavioral health care across the spectrum, from preventive to early intervention to long-term care and serious care for those with more acute needs. So we'll talk about it, but we are focusing this year on 2 things, because we have assessed the political landscape and we see that these are the places where Care First is necessary, and our advocacy really matters. We know that we need to democratize the budget process to make it transparent and public. We know that this county has a bunch of money in its reserves, and that the time to use those reserves is in crisis, right? And we see that our residents are in crisis, and we deserve that. I'm also going to say that y'all should read in these slides, because I won't be taking all the time in the world to read these. And then the second part of our main demands this year is really focusing on directing Measure W funds for housing and support for the most vulnerable populations. This must include, at the very least, $77 million a year for deep rental subsidies, $203 million to increase permanent supportive housing access, $87 million towards licensed boarding cares, and $121 million to increase staffing and operational costs at these facilities. So we'll jump into that later on, but you can see this is a lot of money. This would make a humongous difference in our county. We are going to be fully transforming the way that housing and support services are accessed by our most vulnerable populations if the county decides to use Measure W in a way that aligns with the voters' needs. So we'll talk more about that, but we're talking about housing as healthcare this year, y'all, and that's going to be a big focus. All right, gonna pass it on. John, I think that's you.
Yeah, so if you can advance to the next slide. So we're gonna now go into what are some of the issues, why things are the way they are, and how that shows up in the budget in a few different ways. If you can go to the next slide. So this is something that I'm sorry that we were on a different one. So we know.
Oh, John, I can take this slide. Sorry about that.
Sure. Yeah, go for it.
For sure. Sorry. So rearranged a little bit. So yeah, just to give ourselves a little bit more context, we are facing more than just a county crisis, right? We know that the problem in Alameda County stems from the problems that we see globally, federally, and the state level. And just we're going to start by saying, like, yeah, our funding, our budgets are really skewed. We see that from the federal level all the way down, we are seeing that funding for war, militarism, policing, and incarceration are being funded far and beyond our care and community's vital resources. And if you just keep clicking, yeah, so we see at the state level, and at the federal level, all the way down to local city levels and county levels, the criminalization of homelessness is rampant. We're watching from the state level and the grants pass decision, Governor Newsom really deciding that criminalizing homelessness is one of his priorities at this point, using the police system to actually take poverty, and instead of seeing it as a human need that people have for resources and support, we're seeing it as a way to criminalize folks for not having a place to stay because housing costs are over the roof. And we see that federal funding cuts are creating massive instability for so many folks in all these areas. We're seeing that Medicaid and Social Security and the Department of Education are being cut. We're seeing a rise of fascist policies. We are seeing people at the federal level and in many other states, luckily not as much in our state of California, but people trying to get to basically putting an all-out war on migrants into the mainstream media. We're seeing that at our local county level. One of our facilities, Dublin Women's Prison, which was recently closed due to massive sexual assault and human rights abuses, is now being sought as a potential ICE detention center. We're seeing a wave of right-wing and conservative forces taking over in our local politics, creating space for recall efforts to get progressive and even moderate or liberal folks out of office. We saw that with the recall of DA Price. We saw that with the fact that Oakland has had 4 mayors in 6 months. And we are seeing that overall, the media is pushing narratives that are tough on crime, that are seeing people who are outside of upper and middle class folks and American citizens, white folks, cis hetero folks, that are villainizing all of our communities and are seeing us as disposable. And so when we think about all of those ways that we see the media and elected officials perpetuating narratives that hurt us, we see that the crises of this moment require collective action. And I will say that you can see in all these pictures, like these are protest shots, right? Folks are protesting, even though some of these protests are to recall DA Price. We're seeing that collective action is on the rise because we are all experiencing a compounding set of crises. And so one of the ways that we really want people to understand the budget is as a place for collective action. And I will ask for the next slide. And now I'll pass it.
Actually, if you can go back, because I want to say one other thing about this, which is that this week the county held another budget meeting and heard from the state. The state, and earlier this week, the governor issued the revision, mid-year revision to the state budget, and they're looking at a $12 billion shortfall from their projections. So you've heard a lot probably about what the federal administration is doing that is creating all kinds of issues. There's a lot of uncertainty about the county's budget is approximately 2/3 dependent on state and federal funds. So at both levels, there's a lot of uncertainty and there's also a shortfall that the county and the state are trying to figure out what to do with. So that's compounding all of the issues that Kari was talking about in terms of criminalization and skewed priorities. So if we go to the next one, this is where we see this because it precedes the rightward turn of Governor Newsom. It precedes the Trump administration. These are structural issues in our county, beyond our county too, but this is one way it shows up in our county. So the red line here is the number of people incarcerated in Santa Rita jail in the county. And you can see that in the last 16 years, the number has steadily gone down. Some of that is because of state law reforms. Some of it is because the number of offenses has actually gone down, reported offenses. But in any case, it's practically a third of what it was in 2008, the number of people incarcerated on a daily basis. But at the same time, the sheriff's budget, more than half of which is for the jail, has continued to go up and up and up and up. Some of this is a result of litigation that resulted in a settlement in 2021 called the Babu settlement, which was supposed to provide better mental health care in the jail. But what it did was drastically increase the number of deputies on the staff. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment, but you can see that there's something really wrong with this picture, right? As the number of people in the jail go down, the sheriff's budget should also go down. Instead, it has been going up and up and up. Um, so the different kinds of, a lot of times we will hear remedies, but they're often not remedies that actually address the structural issues in play, the really punitive narratives that are driving the outcomes of incarceration and criminalization. So, for example, one of the Care First recommendations has to do with fair chance housing. That because many people who come out of prison or jail are not eligible for a lot of different kinds of housing. And so they can't find a place to live. And in Alameda County, the Board of Supervisors adopted a sort of half reform that was opposed by advocates because it wouldn't really address the needs of people who are coming out of prison. So because people coming out still don't have access to housing, or there are criteria for a program it's a diversion program called CARES Navigation, but the criteria set up by the state of California are really restrictive for diverting. You can't do it with a felony. You can't do it with somebody who has a prior sex offense. You can't do it with somebody who is in an active mental health episode. Like there's many different restrictions. And so it means that, very few people use it. Or you have things where the DA opposes diversion in what are called mental health courts or diversion courts, collaborative courts. But the DA can hold it up, and people meanwhile continue to be in Santa Rita, even though they've been admitted into what is supposed to be a system or a court that will help them be decarcerated. Or we find that there are growing forces in our county that support, like the recall of Pamela Price, and then strongly supported someone who is much more of a law and order prosecutor to be the new DA. Or like the Babu settlement that I just mentioned, there are liberal attorneys who litigate supposedly for better treatment of people inside the jail. And they do change some of the rules for people inside the jail, but at the same time, they grow the jail and make the jail more the go-to place to receive mental health care in the county. And that's just wrong. You can't, it shouldn't be that you have to go to jail in order to get mental health care. Um, if we can go to the next one, this is where you can see the different costs. And it's really important, I think, also right now, because when there are deficits, and right now the county is trying to close a more than $100 million deficit between expected revenues and expenses in the coming year, the temptation is to do short-term things, right? Is to do things that are not investments that will save money in the long run. And we know, and you can see it here, that if you invest in care in people, if you invest in housing for people or treatment for people at different levels, like people have different levels of acuity, people have mental health crises or illness, or people have a substance use disorder. If you are able to really help people when they first have an episode of psychosis or of some kind of mental illness, you can actually stop the illness in its tracks. And so that kind of investment is on the front end, right? But instead, you can see that the county is investing in the back end, in the jail, and it's so much more expensive. So it's more than $260,000 per person per year for someone to be in the jail. That is extraordinarily expensive. I don't know anybody in this room who makes that much money in a year, but that's how much the county is paying. Whereas even a very restrictive kind of care for people who have a pretty acute level of inpatient care um, is it's still expensive, 170,000. Whereas permanent supportive housing, which is what we'll get to in terms of what we want the county to invest in and use existing funds to invest in, still costs over $100,000 a year per person, but is a much stronger investment. And then full service partnerships are the county's wraparound services that are the highest level of services to provide to people. And if someone is in some kind of stable housing, that's an even less expensive investment. Um, so here's next one is where we're looking at the housing investment. So the people who are unhoused have a lot of other things going on. Many of them, a very disproportionate number, are Black. Same with the people who are in the psychiatric hospital or in Santa Rita jail. Many have had encounters with police in the past year, practically a third. Um, Practically half either have a substance use disorder or a serious mental illness. And so those factors all combine to make this really, really difficult situation to overcome without some sustained support. So, and we've seen that the county has come together, has created what is called the Home Together Plan, which is probably the most functional plan that the county has for addressing any social issue of any kind. It's very specific. It's very thought out. It looks at what kinds of investments are needed. It's joined by an assessment of the unmet need, and so they're counting every 2 years the number of people who are unhoused. It came down for the first time last year but it is still extremely high, and there's still a lot of people who are coming. There's still almost as many people who are becoming unhoused as who are going back into housing who are unhoused. If we can go to the next one. Um, so there's in order to make any of these things happen, we have to have clear and shared public information. And part of what I just described, the county is assessing unmet needs for housing. We are pressing for better information on how many of the people who are unhoused are formerly incarcerated and coming out of jail, or who have a mental illness, or who have a substance use disorder, whose needs you can't just dump people in housing, right? So we need to know how many of the people who are unhoused have more complex needs, because the budgeting is going to have to correspond to the services that are needed along with the permanent supportive housing. And so the Department of Homelessness and Health and Housing Services is working on that. But we also don't know how much money the county has in unrestricted or even restricted reserves. The county administrator's office is a very, very tight office. It's been run by the same person for 30 years. And they've been asked information by this coalition, by county supervisors, and they have not yet even met with the committee that is overseeing implementation. And there are several Care First recommendations that are explicitly calling for the county administrator to publish information about what is in reserves, but also what is been budgeted but not spent, right? So that could be staff in the jail, because it's very difficult to get staff, both deputies as well as behavioral health staff in the jail. It could be other parts of the county budget that are not spent, um, that are not yet spent. And then finally, there's a lot of just not lack of public engagement. So the meeting that I went to this week, for example, on the budget, there was basically no notice. You had to be closely following county obscure websites in order to know that it was going to happen. And so I was the only one who gave a public comment because nobody knew about it. And similarly, the county administrator's office and others in the county don't really engage the public about it. So that's an important piece. Um, so finally here, we're going to go to questions and answers in just a moment. We really want to hear what you're thinking, what you want to know, what you are trying to understand better. But why is this so urgent? It's urgent. I think it's been clear that the people are suffering from the county's skewed priorities and lack of attention, and the whole framework of downstream, uh, putting people into jail, putting people into the psychiatric hospital instead of really addressing people's needs upstream. But we're also facing a crisis, a kind of a narrative crisis, in which there are right-wing forces that are calling for locking up more people. They're calling for people who are homeless to be locked up without any real alternatives. Um, and so the criminalization, both at the federal, at the state, and at the local level, is pressing on the agenda for Care First and Jails Last. Um, so we know that the county has a lot of money. The county is flush. If you talk with city officials in Alameda County, like I talked at this budget meeting with the county treasurer, who said the county treasury is growing by 10% a year. And he said he doesn't really see the reserves them per se, or the spending per se, but the county has a lot of resources, but it's holding them very closely rather than having a system that is responsive to the community. So that's why our mobilization is so key, in order to really open up the process and redirect the resources of this county towards they're needed, where people can be healthy and safe. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Thank you so much, John. And we've come to our first Q&A break. We want to uplift some questions from y'all, and we do have a couple we want to start with. The first one is, I think, John, you could maybe tackle this one. It's related to the Babu settlement. This person says, you suggested that a settlement forced the county to commit money for wraparound services and full service partnerships. Was that part of the Babu settlement or part of the Disability Rights California settlement? Just curious.
Yeah, good question. So there have been two sets of litigation. The Babu settlement was focused on the jail primarily. And that settlement was the one that required more staff in the county jail, both mostly sheriff staff, but also behavioral health staff that are employed by the county. The Disability Rights California settlement, which is more recent, required the county to invest in full service partnerships and do some assessments about unmet need. The county, it is more recent. It was just last year that it was finalized. And so the county is still responding. We're still trying to get information from the county about the level of investments and unmet need for full service partnerships and the wraparound services.
Amazing. Thank you, John. Another sort of question statement we have from someone is stating, curious how there are always beds at San Rita jail, but to get into Villa, you have to prove, or your loved ones and providers have to prove you have been really sick for a while. Would any of our panelists like to speak to that? Yeah, Kari, come in.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate this comment. It really highlights the absurdity and inequities that we see that we've normalized in our county, where our jail is, as John was saying, continuously decreasing in population. We're happy to know that there are empty cells, and that there's a lot of wasted space and wasted staffing. And at the same time, it is ridiculous because people that are in really serious need of a place to be and the care that they deserve are not getting placed in subacute and acute housing spaces where they could get serious mental health care and support, as well as supportive housing. And so, yeah, the reason is because the county has prioritized incarceration and criminalization over care. And we have seen that the county's still using a jail first, care last way of thinking. And there's no reason or rationale that I can understand besides the fact that they have decided that it makes more sense to go funding sheriffs and deputies rather than funding social workers, peer counselors, care providers. And we see that that is something that we are going to have to keep fighting for every single year. Yeah, and thank you, John. I'll just read out in the chat that John said, Santa Rita Jail is enormous. It has over a capacity of more than 4,000. The jail population was only about 1,600 this last year. Subacute facilities like Villa Fairmont and even the psychiatric hospital, John George, has such a limited capacity, less than 200 beds each. And a lot of the ways that we see the best care for people with serious behavioral health needs is in smaller scale spaces, smaller scale facilities where we can have more personalized support. But we could still fund those facilities and have them spread out throughout the county instead of people being warehoused in a place like Santa Rita Jail. Okay, I will pass it back to Nat.
Okay. Let's see. We have some great questions. Someone's wondering, would you agree that a big problem with the cost comparison between treating someone in Santa Rita versus supporting someone in the community is the fact that the sheriff is never held accountable for reducing the ACSO budget?
Yeah, I can quickly answer that question. Thanks, Jean. I'll zoom out and say that no matter what department you're running, right? If you're an agency head, there's literally no incentive for you to propose a reduced budget, right? It would assume that you have less work to do, I don't think anyone is interested in having a smaller budget if you're directing that agency. But it's actually the Board of Supervisors' job, right, to be making those decisions. Every dollar that gets sent to every agency is determined by the supervisors. And so, we need to have a set of supervisors that are more critical, that are not only asking questions, but are following through on the questions and the priorities that they have passed. And so, yeah, I would put that onus less on the sheriff's department and more on those 5 supervisors.
Thank you, Tash. Amazing. All right, y'all, we will have another break moment for Q&A, but that is the amount of questions we can ask for now. So we're gonna jump right back in just a second. All righty. And Tash, I think you are up.
Oh, all right. All right. So I'm gonna cover this section, which is basically like, again, zooming out, like who's part of the budget? What is the Alameda County budget process? What has that been like? How is the county budget funded? And how has the county supervisors spent its funds? So what is the context of all of this? And I'm also going to talk a bit about like what is this big pot of money called Measure W that everyone is writing about and talking about, and what opportunities do we have to like make the most of this big pot of funding in the county, which is very like rare and important in this political moment. So the county budget actually process happens like basically for half of the year. Starting in January, all county departments draft their budgets. This is based on their priorities, based on mandates. And in April, there is an early budget hearing that the county administrator like holds. So a lot of what we're sharing from you with you today is stuff that we learned at the April 15th early budget hearing. And in mid-June, sometime probably the second week of June, this is when the county administrator submits like her proposed budget, right? So the early budget hearing is just kind of like, what is the county economically facing? It's in early April. We heard from every department make pitches. And basically what we're going to hear on the second week of June is how is the county administrator like threading all of these pieces together? And then in the last week of June, our budget hearings, budget deliberations, and a final budget adoption. So for us as budget organizers, it's really go mode, right? And in the month of June, but it's really important that we organize year round to influence those agency heads to include our priorities in their draft budgets, right? So it's not just like the high pitch moment that's important. It's the consistency of organizing and advocacy that gets us these wins, right? Because if you're only organizing in the last 2 weeks of June, you're really just fighting over like a few dollars and cents, right? The budget is basically half baked. But it still is very, very, very important. And I put some asterisks by those dates because those are all tentative. We actually don't have like a calendar like other cities do. Like the city of Oakland announces all of the times and meetings that all of their budget hearings will be. That does not happen in this county because we have a very tough county administrator. Next slide. So who influences the budget? It's these 5 county supervisors. These 5 county supervisors oversee a county that is made up of 1.6 million people. We are the 7th most populous county in the state, made up of like 14 cities, 6 unincorporated areas. Currently, Supervisor Halbert is board president, I believe. And he represents East County, Livermore, Pleasanton. He represents the area where Santa Rita Jail is. District 2 is Supervisor Elisa Marquez. She represents South County, Hayward, Union City, Newark. Supervisor Tam in District 3 represents the entire city of Alameda, the Fruitvale, San Lorenzo, I believe parts of San Leandro, right, and parts of East Oakland. Supervisor Nate Miley is the OG. He's been supervisor for like 30 something years. He's kind of the longest standing one there. I think all the other supervisors have been there for about like 4 years max. And so if you go to a county meeting, you'll see that like he takes up a lot of space because he brings a lot of history and has a lot of command. He represents many of the unincorporated areas, Cherryland, Castro Valley, Ashland, as well as Deep East Oakland. And last but not least, District 5 is newly elected Nikki Fortunato Bass. Some would say that she is the most progressive candidate. She comes from the city of Oakland, where she actually did a lot of work to make the budget process much more transparent. She represents West Oakland, downtown Oakland, the lake, and all of Berkeley. And so the board's role is really both executive and legislative. They set priorities, they approve the budget, they control county property and what is done to that, which is really important when it comes to housing, and they pass local laws. And as John said, the county is trying to close right now a $100 million deficit, and so that's what's on their minds. Next slide. All right, these are our key agency directors. The county board of supervisors, they pass like overarching laws and policies, and it's really up to these agency directors to see them through, right? And they get a lot of say over how they want to implement something, right? And so some are elected and some are not, right? And so what feels a bit unfair in this county is that a lot of law enforcement department heads are elected, but a lot of healthcare department heads are not. They are appointed. So politically, some have more power than others. And the Board of Supervisors, as you all know, the district attorney recently got recalled. They appointed a law and order candidate, former judge, Ursula Dixon. She will see through Pamela Price's term through 2026, and she hopes to run for reelection. So outside of the budget process, we are organizing her to really maintain and expand diversion opportunities, as Kari has shared before. And these are our two healthcare heads, behavioral healthcare, Dr. Karen Tribble, who oversees the Care First process, as well as a newly appointed interim department head, Anika Chaudhry. All right, Susan Maranishi. She is the county administrator. She was appointed in 1995, so she's been in this role for a very, very long time. And the county administrator's role, some counties call them the CEO. They are really hold the purse strings of the county, right? So they provide budget analysis and recommendations for the board. They prepare the entire annual budget. And they get to decide how they run a budget process, right? They set the tone for how it's run and how democratic it is. And so, as John has mentioned, Susan Maranishi really runs the county budget process with an iron curtain. She does the bare minimum to inform the public of what's going on in the budget process. She only notifies us when she's legally mandated to, so 72 hours in advance. And oftentimes when we hear that there's a budget hearing, there are not even like items or attachments that are included, right? So she wants you to go there in person. She wants it to make it really hard to understand, which is why we're holding budget trainings like this so that you all understand it and we can push her and the county supervisors to be more democratic. The last thing I'll say, she is the highest paid county employee in all of California. In 2023, her total pay and benefits amounted to $919,000. So yeah, our tax dollars at work right here. But I would say that the people who have the most power in the budget process, and I think this is something that we forget, is that taxpayers, residents, voters, all of us have the most power in this process. We foot all of their salaries, we vote them in, we vote them out, and we should be helping them determine what the county's priorities are, which is why it's so important to organize and to be informed. All right, so what influences, like what is our county budget made up of, right? As we can see here, this is the county budget that we're currently in, so fiscal year 2024, 2025. And when we look, I copy and pasted this from the county's budget book directly. We can see that California, the state of California, sends like $1.8 billion to Alameda County, and the federal government provides $589 million. So altogether, state and federal aid accounts for Alameda County's like around 53% of our funding. A lot of that is mandated. It's required that those funds go to certain things like Medi-Cal, like housing. A lot of those funds do not go for the things that we don't care about. So those don't go to the jail. Next. Oh, actually, I'll just say here, if you go back to this last slide, is that, we're hearing a lot about federal cuts, state cuts. We're hearing a lot about tariffs, right? Which also influence how people spend money, right? Property tax. But as of right now, it's really unclear how those cuts are really going to impact the county. And so even the county doesn't really know that or can really testify to that, which is why it's so important that we use this moment to fortify the services that are really life affirming to our people. Next slide. All right, so this is what the county actually has control over, right? Although the county budget is around $4.5 billion, the county supervisors really have full control over 1.1 billion of those dollars. And we call that discretionary revenue. That revenue is made up of property tax, sales tax, and some service charges. And so if you look at this, right, if a budget is a moral document and it reflects our values, we can see here that 46% of the county's own funding goes to public protections, which includes the district attorney. It also includes the public defender, the courts, and the jail. And 17% of our funding goes to healthcare, right? And so we're here to really upset this setup, especially knowing that there are massive cuts coming from the state and feds around healthcare and medical services, as well as HUD as well. All right, so Measure W. Here to talk about some of the juicy stuff about Measure W, because there's a lot of controversy over this now. And I'm going to do some myth busting on this slide. So if we go back to season 1 of COVID-19, the COVID emergency, the supervisors recognized that this was a moment, right, to really support folks in need. And so they placed on the ballot an increase of a sales tax for 10 years to bring in more revenue to, quote, provide essential county services, including housing and services for those experiencing homelessness, right? In November, voters passed it by just over 50%. But unfortunately, directly in response to that, a conservative group called the Taxpayers Association challenged the validity of this measure that the voters passed, right? And although they challenged the validity of it, the county had implemented it because the voters passed it. And since 2021, the county has accrued $650 million in this pot of funding. Luckily, in the legal battle, the county won. So now we have access to $650 million. The Board of Supervisors have to decide how they spend it. And actually, both housing departments, right, the housing department that builds housing and the housing department that provides homeless services, have a multi-year plan on how they're going to expand housing, right? How they're going to use all of this funding. However, times have changed. There are a bunch of new supervisors. There's only one supervisor left who was around in 2020. And some of the supervisors Nate Miley and possibly Supervisor Tim, is trying to spend that funding on other things that don't include housing. And so right now, right, we know that since 2020, as you saw in that chart, homelessness, unsheltered folks, like our crisis has only grown. So right now we got to organize to protect this funding to go towards housing services, long-term permanent supportive housing, and not just like transition housing for folks. The process of figuring out Measure W is not baked in the budget process. It's a process that will happen after, starting in July, which is why we're not only organizing, in this moment, but we really want to encourage you to follow the money with us into the summer so that we can ensure that this funding doesn't go towards the jail. Because if they do open it up, it will likely go towards the jail and other things that are potentially harmful to our people. So I know I just talked a lot, but I'm just going to summarize. If you walk away with anything, these are the things that you should know. Number one, our county does not prioritize our people's urgent needs, right? As you saw in how they spend their discretionary funding. They have spent almost 2.5 more times on public protections and the jail. And so we got to really turn that around, especially since the jail population is 1/3 of the size as it used to be. And we really got to try to bust open this budget process, right? We got to build the political will of these boards of supervisors to make this process more transparent. They're all frustrated when we talk to them one-on-one, but there are not enough people in the room to encourage them to make it transparent, right? As you heard yesterday, John was the only person who provided public comment. That is not okay, and that is exactly what the county administrator wants. With that, I'll pass it over to John on what we can do about this.
So a lot of people think about, I think these days, maybe even more than in the past, doing advocacy by going to a meeting and making a public comment, which is really important. It is the most public, other than like protests in the street, it is in some ways the most public part of advocating for what we want. But there's a lot of other places where we can and we should be doing that. And a lot of it is in the conversations that happen out in the community and in the media, because that's where the overall frame for our priorities, and that's what a budget is. It's an expression of priorities. Um, but that's where we begin that conversation about, okay, well, they have all these people who are suffering a lot, who are, we could be spending our money in such a different way. And so whether you write a letter to the editor, you do work on social media, you work in your community organization, to set up an event. I mean, there's many different ways of shaping that narrative and places where we need to do that. And that is really key all year round, but also now when the counties is definitely looking at this. Another is to, apart from the meetings, to call and email your supervisor. It's not that difficult to do. We've got, there's lots of material here that you can use. Sometimes it can be a very just simple message like, I want you to implement the Care First recommendations and I want you to use Measure W funds for housing. Very simple. That's it, Um, you can also, like I said, go to public comment. So we will be, especially if you are on the Signal thread or connect with us in other ways, we can alert you to when these things are coming up, both like when it's like later this week, but also even the day of. Because a lot of times in these meetings, we don't really, they get scheduled for 2 o'clock and then there's a presentation and then it goes on and on and on and somewhere in the agenda. And then public comment might not come up until 4 or 6 or whenever. And so we can also alert people to when it's coming up so that you don't have to spend your entire day waiting for the moment to raise your hand virtually. And all of these meetings have both an in-person and a virtual component. The county will take comments, public comments in both ways. And then, we really need to build this coalition. We need to build out with different sectors, people who are in healthcare, people who are in unions, people who are in impacted communities, people who are in South County or who are in East County, people who are older or younger or who are in different demographics, who are BIPOC people. We need everybody at the table for this in different ways. And then, we also do set up direct meetings with supervisors and their staff and also with county agencies. Most of us here are part of the committee that is monitoring implementation of Care First, and we are having meetings with county agencies. We are able to invite people who are outside that committee to participate, especially if they have some kind of firsthand or specific knowledge about the issue that we're meeting about. And then finally, of course, there's like organizing stuff in the street, which can be super empowering. It can get media coverage. It's a way to connect with other people and build community, and really key for keeping this movement alive and moving towards our priorities.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Tash. I am gonna just take us through. We are in the last few chapters of this training, y'all. Thank you for being here. We are talking in this last section about the solutions that we are fighting for and why. We went through what we've won already and how we got here. And we want to just frame that this year, because of what Tash shared about Measure W and because of what John shared about how the budget works, we are focusing on the strategic and timely use of the funds that we have access to, that we know that the Board of Supervisors can use to make a serious impact on the crises in our county today. So like I said, that means that this year we're really focused on housing as healthcare, and the fact that our mental health care system is still so under-resourced is actually something that we know we're going to continue fighting for through working on the county processes and supporting smaller scale community-based programs. But that the demands that we have for mental health care focused budget items are really going to be put into next year's budget. So what we're doing right now also is building power and trying to educate as many county residents as possible to get involved in this movement for decarceration and community-based care, so that next year we can really show up to these Board of Supervisors processes with a whole contingent seeking support for holistic, life-affirming behavioral health care. Next slide, please. So with that being said, just wanted to share a little bit about the guiding framework that we use at the Care First Community Coalition, and that a lot of advocates are using this in this day and age, although the media and a lot of our elected officials like to not promote it. This is called Housing First. So the first graphic that you can see is the typical way that housing and homelessness services are provided. It's a very circuitous route where people that are experiencing homelessness or at risk of homelessness are cycled through shelter systems, transitional housing systems, and basically have to prove that they are ready to get housing in order to get support getting permanent, stable housing. And obviously, as we know, housing is a problem that affects people that are very low income and working class. And so for many of us in the Bay Area, housing is simply inaccessible, whether or not we have serious mental health issues or justice involvement. But for folks at the intersection of those problems, it's extremely difficult to access and maintain stable housing. So clients or folks fall out of these systems and get pushed back into incarceration or homelessness all the time. So the issue that we are interested in pushing for is a framework called Housing First. And Housing First interventions are research-backed policies that actually are seen to reduce homelessness for the most vulnerable people, the folks that are consistently, chronically entering homelessness. And it is a framework that undergirds a lot of the housing investments that we prioritize in the Care First Jail's last budget platform. What it means is, put simply, the solution to homelessness is having a home. It seems simple, but it's a real departure from our current systems, economic systems, and service systems, because what we see right now is that housing is understood as a luxury and a reward for meeting other societal expectations and having enough money to pay for it. Housing First means that everyone deserves housing. It's a human right, and folks are given access to housing and services so that they can then create the life stability and get themselves the support, whether that's treatment or employment or different relationships that they need in order to continue having stability and maintaining their housing, but that they are not required to do those things before getting access to that support. So if we go to the next slide, one of the main housing first interventions that we are advocating for that we've mentioned is permanent supportive housing and licensed board and cares. So both of these interventions are designed for people who are really at the margins of society, who are really not getting their support needs met through the current systems that we have in place. For folks who have serious behavioral health needs, developmental disabilities, medical health needs, and who are at the intersection of criminalization and homelessness. For permanent supportive housing is an intervention that is proven by the research to increase folks' physical health and well-being and keep them stably housed for longer. And it minimizes emergency room stays, hospital stays, arrests, nights in jail, and by doing that, saves the county thousands and thousands of dollars per person over the long term on both healthcare, emergency department, and police contact and jail stays. So the research is very robust on permanent supportive housing being an intervention that is extremely supportive to actually solving the homelessness crisis. And as John shared in an earlier slide, it is expensive at the front end, but saves money and creates long-term stability on the back end. So, and licensed boarding cares are a type of supportive housing that is really smaller scale units, smaller scale homes that are run by people who are really able to provide serious supportive 24/7 care to folks with really high needs. And they are unfortunately very underfunded by our county and state. So we need the county to pour a lot more money into these to keep them available. And unfortunately as well, about 58 facilities that used to be critical housing for folks at the margins have been closed because of the funding gaps in the past few years. Yes, thank you so much. The second big housing intervention is it's very simple. It's rental subsidies, giving people enough money so that they can pay their rent and stop having housing insecurity and minimize their risk of homelessness. So basically, deep rental subsidies are ways that folks can pay about 30% of their income, which is seen as a reasonable housing burden for the average person. And whatever their income is, whether it's very low or extremely low, those are the two categories that are eligible for deep rental subsidies. They pay that 30% and then the program pays the rest of their rent. So basically that means that people are providing for themselves in the ways that they can, and that our government supports them by allowing them to maintain their housing and stability by filling in that gap. And we really have a need for this because at the current state of affairs, people that are coming home from incarceration or have justice involvement do not qualify for almost any rental subsidies. And so folks that are coming home from incarceration already face a bunch of barriers to getting and staying housed and to having the economic stability that would allow them to pay rent in a market rate housing unit. And so we need the county to jump in and fund rental subsidies for people with behavioral health needs and justice involvement. And this is a really cost-effective way to do that because there's no services involved. It's really just a payment. It's giving people the money they need to stay supported. Wow, incredible. I will just say that what Tash shared about Measure W is really important here because we know that folks are going to be able to get that housing support if the county just pours the money in. It's that simple. We are creating the infrastructure to do that, and we want to push the county to do that as soon as possible because every day our crisis of homelessness and economic inequality is getting worse, and we know how to solve it. So to do that, we need y'all to throw down with us. We are mobilizing, as we said, starting this week. We're going to the Board of Supervisors on May 22nd. You will get to see some of our very own people in this room speaking to the board, explaining the solutions that we are advocating for, and showing that the Mental Health Advisory Board, which is the body that the county has directed to research these solutions and advocate for them in the ways that make sense. We will be presenting on those, and we need citizens, residents, people in the community to show up and make sure that the BOS knows that we mean business. You can also sign up for Restore Oakland's newsletter, where we'll be creating toolkits and action alerts so that you can get involved as new dates for the Board of Supervisors, budget advocacy, if budget processes become public. And we're gonna have a Care First Jail's Last Art Build and press conference during budget season. We're gonna be creating signs and posters. We're gonna be holding some rallies, and we will be inviting you all to join us. So if you sign up for the newsletter and sign up in the Signal chat, we will be providing that information as soon as we get it. And we really just want to thank you all for being down to participate, because as we've shown, these processes are deeply, deeply inaccessible. And people are trying their hardest to stop the public from getting their voices heard. And we are trying to counter that by building our capacity and our power to engage. So I will just put us in our last little section where we'll do some Q&A. We've gotten a ton of questions, and I know that our facilitation team is trying to figure out how to get them all answered in a reasonable amount of time. So let's see. One moment, y'all. I'm gonna look at, wow, holy cannoli. Okay, we have a bunch of questions. Do we want to start just with the ones that feel most relevant that came first? Okay. I want to see that there's a couple Measure W questions. So maybe Tash, if you want to take those, that would maybe be helpful. I see that there's a simple question of, it seems illegal that Measure W be used for things other than housing and homelessness, if that's what was voted on. Do you want to start there?
Yeah, one would say it is illegal. And I think that the Board of Supervisors who want to spend that on non-housing things are using the argument of saying these are general fund dollars. These are not restricted funds. So when they looked at the ballot initiative, they're like, sometimes we pass a measure to pay for a bond or something like that, to take on debt to be able to pay for housing. The county did that, I think, like 8 or 10 years ago, right? But this is actually funding that goes straight into the general fund, which is what Nate Miley is using to say, well, if it's general fund money, we could spend it however we want. And the ballot initiative does not technically restrict us from that, and is using the deficit in this political climate to justify that. When we pressed his office about what he wanted to spend that money on, they said deferred maintenance of the county's properties, many of which is at Santa Rita Jail. And then they also said rental arrears, which is paying back landlords and maybe some housing providers for rent that they did not receive during the eviction moratorium. So again, where their priorities are and why we need to organize and push back.
Beautiful. Thanks, Tash. Yes, I see that there was another question in the chat earlier about the Treasury. So earlier it was said that the Treasury was growing, but also that there's a deficit. Can you help us understand that part? And John, I'm going to kick it to you.
Yeah. So, this was just something that the treasurer said to me in a very short conversation. So I think that probably what it refers to is that the budget is a year-to-year document and plan for revenue and expenses. But the county also has money that in reserves, money in its bank accounts, or investments. And that's what's growing. That's not reflecting the year-to-year expenditures and revenues of the different county departments and the county as a whole. So it's the deficit is basically each department says, okay, this is how much we expect to spend if we maintain the same level of programming. And this is how much we expect in revenues. And that's the $100 million plus deficit that is going to be closed. So I suspect that it won't be that difficult. Every year it's like 60 million, 70 million, and they never have any difficulty closing it. They always close it. Some of it they close with things that are one-time changes, and sometimes they change it with something that is a more permanent change in any of the department's expenses or revenues. So I think that's the difference. I would love to, hear more from the treasurer about, where those funds live and how accessible they are. Again, this is part of the issue of transparency, where you have to, go to a almost secret county budget meeting, sit behind the treasurer by accident, and have the treasurer make a public comment, and then have the treasurer turn around and say, "Hey, are you studying the budget?" And then me asking him a question. Like, that was the only way that we got that information. So that is really why the Care First recommendations include several recommendations about transparency. And when we show up before the Board of Supervisors on Thursday of this coming week, that is going to be one of the things that we are talking about, is that the county administrator has not been implementing these recommendations that have to do with the transparency of the budget. So that meeting will really be about how can the board give an instruction to advance the Care First plan by giving instructions to the county departments, whether it's behavioral health, whether it's the sheriff and the DA, or whether it's the county administrator.
Thank you so much, John. Yeah, super helpful. I am looking at the question around providing sanctuary for folks without papers. Yeah, Tash, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I think there's endless work to do on that front. And as we see today, like currently not enough. And I think before I answer that question specifically, I want to zoom out and talk about just like make a point. Like right now we see there's like two ways in which a lot of politicians or elected officials both, locally, statewide, and federally are responding. They're either reluctant to help people in a moment of urgent crisis, right? Or they will use all of their power to rob and dispossess people, right? And we're really trying to push for the like real urgency and action. And currently there's only like a few supervisors who see that, right? The supervisors who want to advance the status quo and will do everything to do that, or the supervisors who are trying to crack things open. So I would, for example, Supervisor Nikki Bass recently succeeded in moving $3.5 million towards deportation defense, immigrant rights education, and community mutual aid and preparedness. Some of that also includes like some housing navigation services. We know that that is not enough and something that we are fighting for. We know that a lot of undocumented folks and immigrants are locked up in the jails, and a lot of the priorities that we're pushing for that are long-term permanent housing priorities, which usually get deprioritized. The county is obsessed with short-term shelter, you know, transitional things that actually facilitate a lot of create gaps and facilitate a lot of crisis sometimes. And so, yeah, we know that if we can get them and to get the housing department to ensure that justice involved folks, right, are prioritized in the care that they give, right, it means that we're also serving undocumented folks and immigrants. Currently, right now, we know that folks who are getting housing priority are people who have medical health needs, and we're really trying to expand that priority list to include justice involved systems impacted people. As you saw, 30% of the homeless population has been touched by the criminal legal system within just the last year. There was another question Gina asked about. Yeah, I think a lot of the service, a lot of our priorities work both upstream and downstream on either side of incarceration. We really care a lot about preventing incarceration, and the same solutions that we're trying to push forward, like deep rental subsidies, long-term permanent supportive housing, subacute treatment, expanding diversion, right? They all kind of, they can be used on all sides, both coming home and supporting entire families, not just individuals experiencing incarceration.
Yes, Angie, thank you. I think we may have time for one more. If anyone in the facilitation team sees a question that they didn't get to answer that they want to answer, jump in and I'm going to look through.
I see Karis put a question about what's the balance between the construction for needed housing with the ongoing support needed for permanent support housing. And one thing I would note is that Measure W still has revenues coming in until 2030, so for the next 5 years, that can support the ongoing needs as well. But yeah, there's going to be a need for other types of revenues besides Measure W to address the needs for housing in Alameda County, both permanent supportive housing, both capital, as well as ongoing. There is discussion about a bond, a regional bond, as well as a county bond, that could support that for the future, especially when Measure W funds run out. But really, it needs to be the dedication needs to be all the sources that are available to us, and not just Measure W, both for the construction and the capital construction, as well as the ongoing support.
Yeah, and I would just add that one of the solutions or the interventions that we're really excited about is supporting and collaborating with the Supportive Housing Community Land Alliance. And they do work to acquire and renovate and maintain buildings and properties and land in Alameda County that can be then used as permanent supportive housing and licensed boarding cares. They take that property off of the speculative market using a land trust model. So what would be an incredible way to ensure that these funds are used effectively, and then that the cost of living doesn't, for those residents, doesn't go up so high that they're eventually pushed out, or the people that run those boarding cares and supportive housing facilities cannot afford to run them any longer, is to be using a land trust model to get out of the speculative market and stop having housing being commodified, especially for the most low-income people in our county. So Supportive Housing Community Land Alliance, huge partner, huge fan, and we're trying to get the county to provide a lot of funding to them to do this work. I want to say that we're going to be closing out, y'all. I think that I'm just so grateful. I feel like this is a group of people that is clearly committed. It's Saturday. We out here about to go to the MLK Jazz Festival. I know the sun is shining and y'all are here listening to us talk about the budget and the really technical, bureaucratic, some of it is BS that the county puts us through in order to have some autonomy over the way that our taxpayer money is being spent. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We need y'all to continue tapping in. Now you have some more information, and the next step is taking action, right? So we want to build with you. We have an organizing membership. We have a coalition that we are part of and that we are supporting deeply, and that is supporting us deeply in this budget advocacy fight this year. We know that the only way that we're going to have the things that we need and our communities are going to get the support that they deserve is by fighting for that money. So we are going to ask that you please sign up for the Restore Oakland newsletter, get into that Signal chat, and look out on our Instagram and other medias where we will put out calls for action. And we will be seeing you in the streets, in the BOS chamber, and continuing to do this work for the long haul. Thank you all so much.
Thank you to this amazing budget training team for putting this together.
Woohoo! Yay. Thank you all so much for joining us.